The image of a fiery, eternal hell is one of the most powerful and terrifying concepts in religion. But what if I told you that the word hell doesn't actually exist in the original Hebrew and Greek scriptures? What if the foundation of this terrifying realm is built on a 2,000-year-old mistranslation of the grave and a place with a very dark history? We're going to investigate how ancient words for death, the underworld, and a literal valley outside Jerusalem were transformed to create the popular image of hell we all recognize. This isn't just about words, it's a journey into how belief is formed, translated, and sometimes lost in translation. To understand what biblical authors were actually talking about, we have to understand the world they lived in. Long before the Bible was written, ancient cultures had their own ideas about what happens after you die. For the Mesopotamians, the afterlife was a bleak, gloomy place known as the land of no return. It was a shadowy, dusty underworld where the spirits of the dead, both good and bad, just existed. No fire, no torture, just a final, sad destination for everyone. This idea of a neutral, communal underworld was incredibly common. It wasn't a place of reward or punishment. It was simply the end. This is the cultural soil from which the Old Testament grew. When the early Hebrew writers described the afterlife, they weren't thinking of a fiery pit of damnation. They were working with a much older, simpler concept, the grave. And they had a very specific word for it. That word is Sheol. The word Sheol appears about 65 times in the Hebrew Old Testament. For centuries, in popular English translations like the King James Version, it was often translated as hell. This single choice has had a huge impact on the modern Christian imagination. But what did Sheol actually mean to the people who first wrote it? Sheol was a place of silence, darkness, and stillness, a poetic term for the finality of death. It was not a place of conscious, fiery torment. This isn't a fringe opinion. It's a broad consensus among linguistic experts. While the concept of Sheol itself wasn't a place of punishment, it's important to note that ideas about post-death judgment did develop later in Jewish thought, particularly in rabbinic literature, which associated the term Gehenna with a place of purification or punishment for the wicked. So if the Old Testament's land of the dead wasn't a fiery pit, where did that idea come from? The picture starts to come together in the New Testament, with 3 Greek words that would eventually meet the same fate as Sheol, Hades, Tartarus, and the most important one, Gehenna. When the New Testament was written in Greek, the authors used words their audience would immediately understand to talk about death and judgment. But over time, the specific meanings of these words got lost, and they were all flattened into that one terrifying English word, hell. First up, Hades. Appearing 11 times in the New Testament, Hades is the direct Greek equivalent of the Hebrew word Sheol. To the Greeks, Hades was the mythological underworld, the realm of the dead. In the New Testament, it's used in much the same way, a temporary state or place where the dead await the final judgment. It is not the final destination. In fact, the book of Revelation explicitly says that at the end of time, death and Hades are themselves thrown into the lake of fire. So, by its own definition, Hades can't be the eternal hell we think of, because it's described as temporary and will be destroyed. Next, there's Tartarus. This word shows up only once, in the second letter of Peter. In Greek mythology, Tartarus was a deep abyss within Hades used to imprison the titans who rebelled against the gods. The biblical text uses it in a very similar way, to describe a temporary prison for a specific group of rebellious angels who sinned before the flood. It is never described as a destination for human souls. So now we have the grave, and a prison for angels. But that brings us to the big one, Gehenna. This is the word most often tied to fire and punishment, and for good reason. Jesus used it repeatedly, warning of the fire of Gehenna. And when you understand what and where Gehenna was, his warnings become even more vivid. Gehenna wasn't some mystical spiritual realm. It was a real place you could see from the walls of Jerusalem. Gehenna is the Greek name for the Valley of Hinnom, a ravine just south of the city. This valley had a truly dark history. In the Old Testament, it was a place where unfaithful kings practiced the horrific Canaanite ritual of child sacrifice to the god Molech. To end this abomination, the righteous King Josiah desecrated the valley, making it ritually unclean. Now here's where a popular story comes in. A tradition, famously recorded by a rabbi named David Kimhi around 1200 AD, claims the valley then became the city's garbage dump, where fires were kept burning to consume trash, animal carcasses, and the bodies of executed criminals. However, it's important to know that this burning rubbish heap image has no direct archaeological or literary evidence from Jesus' time and is debated by many modern scholars. So what would a first-century audience have understood? They knew Gehenna's history as a cursed, defiled place associated with idolatry and God's judgment. When Jesus used Gehenna as a symbol, he was pointing to a place synonymous with the most horrific sin and its consequences. His warnings about being thrown into Gehenna, where the fire is not quenched, were powerful metaphors for ultimate judgment. Whether this meant complete and final destruction or a state of ongoing punishment is a debate that continues to this day, but the imagery was rooted in a real place of historical dread, not a mythical underworld. So, if we have a Hebrew word for the grave, Sheol, its Greek equivalent, Hades, a prison for angels, Tartarus, and a metaphor based on a cursed valley, Gehenna, how did they all get lumped together as hell? A major moment in this story comes around 400 AD with a scholar named Jerome and his Latin translation of the Bible, the Vulgate. As he translated, he was influenced by the theology of his day, which was increasingly focused on a place of eternal punishment for the wicked, thanks to influential thinkers like Tertullian and Augustine. However, the idea that Jerome single-handedly created hell by translating all these words as infernus, the source of our word inferno, is an oversimplification. While he did use infernus at times for Sheol and Hades, he was actually more nuanced. For instance, he often kept the word Gehenna in its original form in the New Testament. The move to a single concept of hell was less a single decision and more a gradual theological evolution. The developing beliefs of the Church created a framework where a single, terrifying place of punishment made more sense than several distinct ideas. When the Bible was later translated from Latin into English, this simplifying tradition often continued. Early English Bibles, like Wycliffe's and later the King James Version, used the one word hell to cover these different concepts, cementing the idea of a single fiery underworld in the English-speaking world. What was once a collection of distinct concepts, the grave, the underworld, a spirit prison, and a cursed valley, had merged into one terrifying doctrine. Uncovering histories like this is about getting a deeper, more textured understanding of the ideas that have shaped our world. It challenges us to look beyond tradition and ask what the original texts actually say. If you appreciate this kind of historical and linguistic exploration, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss what's next. And now, I want to hear from you. Does this history change how you think about the concept of hell? What questions does it raise? Let me know in the comments below. So, is hell a 2,000-year-old mistranslation? The evidence is compelling. The word hell, as we picture it, doesn't appear in the original manuscripts. Instead, we find a rich and varied vocabulary for what comes after death. We find Sheol, the common grave for all humanity. We find Hades, the temporary holding place of the dead. We find Tartarus, a prison for fallen angels. And we find Gehenna, the very real cursed valley of Jerusalem used as a stark metaphor for final terrible judgment. The modern concept of an eternal fiery underworld is less a direct biblical teaching and more a product of centuries of theological evolution, cultural influences, like Dante's Inferno, and critical translation choices that blended these distinct ideas into one. Understanding this history doesn't mean throwing out the concept of final judgment, but it does provide a crucial lens. It suggests that the warnings of Jesus and the prophets may have been about the profound and total loss of a wasted life, rather than eternal conscious torture. It allows us to separate the powerful metaphors of Scripture from the doctrines built on top of them centuries later. And ultimately, it offers a chance to replace a foundation of fear with one built on historical and linguistic understanding.